What's up, horror fans? Pete here from The Lassercast, where me and my good friend over there, Dr. Zayas God, talk about horror movies and streaming shows. This time around, it's another streaming show. It is Horror's Greatest, which is another one of those documentary shows on Shudder where they get a whole bunch of really cool talking heads to talk about, just some of the best things that are in horror. So this time around, they are talking about giant monsters. Danny, this is like one of your favorite genres, right?
So Charlotte and I were watching this, and we were talking about I was telling her how much I love these types of giant monster movies. I feel like this is one of those things that got me into horror and sci-fi. Like my dad renting me Godzilla movies when I was a kid, watching these like old 50s and 60s sci-fi monster movies. I thought this episode might go into a more man versus nature aspect. I thought Charlotte and I thought we might see like Jaws and the Meg on this episode. I thought we might see like Alligator and Grizzly and movies like that where it's like giant natural predators. And the episode stuck very closely to, I guess, the term monster. And so, like, okay, a shark, no matter how big it is, it's still a shark. An alligator, no matter how big it is still an alligator. So, okay, none of the man versus nature stuff. It was like basically a variety of giant monsters, the classics, the ones that we grew up with, and then a lot of imports from other places around Asia. And then we got some like really cool historical stuff. And I friggin' love that they focus on one of my all-time favorite movies in this. And they give love to Tremors, which that is a movie that deserves all of the love and appreciation that it gets. And I also think this is a very topical thing, given that last year, Godzilla became an Academy Award winner for Best Special Effects. And Godzilla Minus One was way up there on both of our year-end rankings. I think it was your number one. I think it was my number two. Yeah. So for the Lassercast, Godzilla Minus One was our 1.5 best horror movie of 2023. So I think it's a perfect time for a retrospective on kind of the history of giant monsters, and Shudder does these things so well. They had like Michael Dougherty, of course, is like one of the featured talking heads. He took over for a bit the Godzilla franchise with King of the Monsters, which a lot of people love. I like that Jordan Vogt Roberts was included here. He directed Kong Skull Island, which is a movie that my opinion of has very much changed since it came out to having rewatched it. We also have covered Monarch on this channel, which is, what is that, Apple TV, correct?
Correct.
And a lot of Monarch is basically the Godzilla universe, but done on Apple TV. We had some issues with that show, but when the monsters were on it, we liked it, and it did get renewed for a second season. So I think that's a good thing. I like that they also had a lot of Japanese and Asian historians to talk about, the cultural impact of Godzilla and these other kaiju monsters. And what probably the thing that Shudder does the best, and this is where I love watching these shows with Charlotte, is these shows are like perfect for people who are being introduced to the genre. So like Charlotte, I think of every movie listed here, I think Charlotte had only seen Tremors and Godzilla Minus One. I think those might be the only two of the movies she's seen. And she walked away from this like with, as usual, after watching a Shudder documentary, she walked away with a whole handful of movies that she wants to see and that are now on our list. The Host, The Mist, them, Starship Troopers, all the different versions of King Kong.
Yeah.
She was really freaked out by Shin Godzilla. The
Okay.
look of Shin Godzilla, she was like, "Whoa, that is creepy as hell." I was like, "Yeah, that is the weirdest version of Godzilla I think I've ever seen."
Right.
And so she was very interested in that. And yeah, I just had a blast watching this episode.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because when I was thinking about making notes for this show, I was like, man, they did talk about like kaiju a lot. And it brings us back to that conversation that we've had multiple times in the show. I think you and I are on the same page when it comes to this conversation, but it's the what counts as horror conversation, especially that Twitter seems to be pretty obsessed with, right? And what's interesting is that you mentioned The Mist, you mentioned Tremors, you mentioned movies that I would consider to be horror. I mean, The Mist is absolutely horror, right? And then you have movies like King Kong, uh, quite a few of the Godzilla movies, Pacific Rim, where there's absolutely horror elements and there's moments that are very scary in all of the things I just listed. But then there seems to be this like distinction between these movies that have like creatures and stuff in them, but I wouldn't really consider them to be horror. And that's the interesting thing about kaiju movies, especially Godzilla movies, because I almost feel like it can kind of bounce back and forth between two genres. Like there's the scary Godzilla movies, which there are very few of. Then there's sort of like the goofy monster battle movies, which there's a lot of. Right?
Godzilla versus Megalon, where he does the flying tail drop kick and then celebrates by going like this.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
perfect example. But it's funny though, because I think that when these giant monster movies are scary, or if they're not completely scary movies or horror movies, but they like have scary moments, some of them can be the scariest fucking things ever. And I think probably a prime example I think of is Peter Jackson's King Kong, which they talk about a lot in this episode. There's that one sequence where they're attacked by bugs after they fall off the bridge. And that has one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen in a movie. When Andy Serkis gets that like grub worm eating his head slowly while he's still alive. Oh,
So
Jesus Christ.
apparently, I read that that was a scene that they had wanted to film back in like 1933, and it either like they couldn't figure out how to do the effects, or but it was like a scene that was written, and that Peter Jackson like included it in his movie. Because you brought it up, I also something I never even thought of, and again, like Jordan Vogt Roberts, he got a lot of shit after Kong Skull Island came out, because I think
Yep.
he did that like director faux pas where he kind of like argued back at critics that complained about the movie, which is
Right.
you just kind of open yourself up. But having revisited, I rewatched all of the Monarch universe movies when we started
Yeah.
covering Monarch.
Yeah.
And the movie that I had the biggest change of heart about was Kong Skull Island. I went from being like, that was such a ridiculous movie, to, yeah, I think that might be near the top of my friggin' list.
Yeah.
And what I loved about him in this episode is he brings up Peter Jackson's King Kong, and he talks about how no detriment to Jackson's King Kong, which I think is a great movie.
Yeah.
He said that he basically took King Kong and turned him into a giant ape that just
Right.
walks around like a giant ape and
Yeah.
does giant ape things.
Right.
And he said that when he got King Kong for Skull Island, he wanted to go back to the 1933 of a giant ape that stands on two legs and towers above everybody else.
Yeah.
And which is why his Kong is so different. It's such a different movie experience watching the new Kong that we have in like Godzilla versus Kong and what was it? Godzilla X Kong, the New Empire.
Yeah.
Compared to Peter Jackson, who basically made a giant ape movie.
Right.
That's something that never occurred to me. But yeah, I like how you this episode again. The history teacher in me like got all warm and fuzzy because it's like I'm looking at the history of cinema, like King Kong from 1933, all the way to Peter Jackson, all the way to the modern day. They didn't touch on really the 1970s remake of King Kong, which
They
was
didn't.
yeah, that was Jeff Bridges and uh, Jessica Lange. My mom just yelled Jessica Lange from the other room. Thank you.
Thanks, Mrs. Torkel.
Yeah, Jeff Bridges and Jessica Lange. They didn't really touch on that, and that was,
No.
I think, a giant like animatronic. That's like the one that ends up in Universal Studios.
Right.
And so I like how they show kind of the progression of King Kong. I like how they show, Godzilla from 1954. And then we see him become more goofy, like you said, in the 60s and 70s, where he's teaming up and has a son and he's doing drop kicks and he's fighting, teaming up with Jet Jaguar.
Right.
And then, of course, we get the more modern versions of Godzilla with Shin Godzilla and -1, which are so much more friggin' creepy and scary. And I liked watching those evolutions take place.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting is that because let's kind of stick on King Kong for a second. When you think of King Kong, the modern versions, you have Peter Jackson's version where Andy Serkis is King Kong, and they're doing the motion capture, and then Toby Kebbell is King Kong, at least in Skull Island, and I think he might even be in the other ones like Godzilla X Kong or whatever. But what's interesting about those is that it's like a man doing motion capture, and it has that kind of human quality, even though Peter Jackson's Kong is like a big giant gorilla. There's still that sort of that connection, that compassion. I think that's what makes King Kong kind of different. And they even talk about that in this episode where you're rooting for King Kong, even though he's like loose in New York and killing people in every version of King Kong, right?
I think the difference between King Kong and Godzilla is like if you have a pet, a furry pet versus like a reptile or an amphibian, right?
Yeah.
The snake might let you pick it up and might let you touch it, but it's really just there to be fed. And if you stop feeding it, the snake is going to go after you. Like I spent, my wife has bearded dragons that she brings home over the summer, and that my mom actually keeps at her house. Oh, they
Okay.
And the bearded dragons, like one of them, sure, you could pick it up, you could put it in your, but you're not getting any like emotional, like attachment to this lizard. Whereas like you have a dog, I have cats at home. Like you can, you could feel the genuine emotion of like and I think that's really Kong and Godzilla. Like Kong is a living thing. He's an animal that we can identify with, an ape. And he's furry, so you can pet him. He shows emotion towards the women in the movies, of course.
Right.
And then you have Godzilla, who's a giant friggin' lizard who breathes radioactive fire.
Yes, and what kind of blows my mind is that when they talk about Godzilla, they talk about how Gojira literally means gorilla / whale. And that it makes sense, right? Because he walks around on two legs like a gorilla can. But then he also is underwater for a lot of the time too, like a whale, and he's massive like a whale. So it's weird to think that that's the origin of Godzilla's name, because you always think of Godzilla as like a lizard, and there's even versions of Godzilla where it's like, oh, he just was a lizard that got irradiated and became this giant monster. I think especially like the Roland Emmerich version really plays with that, right? So going off of your point that you just made, there is that mammal versus reptile thing where obviously we have more empathy and connect more with the mammal because we are mammals, whereas lizards are more kind of foreign and different from us, and it's also interesting that like King Kong is a movie that takes place in America. it, was made in America, and so we associate King Kong with America, specifically with the Empire State Building in New York, and then Godzilla's from Japan, where obviously they made the first Godzilla movie. But I think, like, going back to what I was saying about like the motion capture and like that human connection, these giant monsters, I think they're a lot scarier when there isn't that empathy. Like King Kong is scary, especially in Kong Skull Island. But the creatures that they show in this episode, they're the ones that the scariest ones are the most foreign ones, the most inhuman, the most different ones. And you brought up this really, really great point about how you thought it was going to have like all these kind of animals that were just maybe big, especially sharks. And then you just made me think of like, shit, there's so many fucking movies they could have used. They could have used like Anaconda. They could have done like Lake Placid, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if there's going to be any kind of episode like that now. And I don't think so.
I think there is, and I think that the episode is trying to make like a clear distinction between like a giant monster movie and a man versus nature movie. Because like in the second, so like the first thing is like the American kaiju, and then they go into the giant bugs, and
right,
like them is not man versus nature. We're not fighting ants. We're fighting like a giant radioactive ant. The black scorpion, tarantula. These are not man versus nature movies where it's like an anaconda is a big snake. The shark in Jaws is a big shark. These are like. And those movies, again, they again, the history teacher in me is like lighting up because it's like these are the nuclear threats, and this is what's going to happen with nuclear war. It's like the American Godzilla, where Godzilla was a reaction to the atomic bomb, and now we are living in fear of the communists, and we're living in fear of we're having air raid drills and the nuclear age. And so, a test in the desert goes wrong, and now we have giant ants. I feel like Archer. This is why we have ants.
Right, right. And it's funny is that like when you're a kid, and it seems like a lot of people have the same kind of origin story. When you're a kid, the very, very first monster movies that you get exposed to are these like giant ants and giant bug movies. Godzilla's in there too in the very beginning. That's what gets you into like horror as a genre, and then you usually move on to like slashers and more complicated movies, or maybe like demonic possession movies. But when I think of giant ants and all this kind of shit, I usually think of Mystery Science Theater at this point. That it's so silly, but I think at the time. Yeah, go ahead.
Exactly. No, it was a different time. It's like we look back at, somebody Charlotte's age or Pepper and Clementine's age looking at the 1933 King Kong might be like, this is so stupid.
Right,
right. I try to tell my students, and I try to tell Charlotte when we're watching things, like, you have to think about when this was made.
Right.
You can't watch a movie from the 30s in the context of like, I know, CGI and insane practical effects. I think it's worse when we see a movie now that is made with bad CGI when we know the level of practical effects that are available. I mean, Godzilla Minus One the budget on Godzilla Minus One was, I think, $15 million, and it looks like the greatest monster movie of the last 50 years. And then you look at the budget of like Quantumania is over 200 million, and I just keep picturing a giant floating head.
MODOK.
MODOK head. But obviously it's obviously a movie like them or the Black Scorpion or the Giant Claw is going to feature on Mystery Science Theater. It's going to feature on what's the other show where they make fun of the movies?
I don't know. I mean, I know Mystery Science Theater. I know that there is Sven Gulli, who is a host in New York. I know he kind of does movies like that too. but they just kind of show the movies. It's the kind of stuff that, like, you know, they'd have on like Elvira and like all these old kind of hosts, you know. But this stuff is fun and it's scary, especially like when it has really good sound design. And you know, you brought up The Mist, which they talk about in this, but they only reference it a little bit in this episode, you know, and they definitely don't bring up the ending, which everyone always talks about, the end of The Mist, right? How it has this gut punch ending. But I think The Mist is a really great example because, you know, when you do giant monsters and you do them in a scary way, they can be the scariest fucking thing. There's one part in the very beginning of this episode where they show that iconic scene from Jurassic Park where the T-Rex comes down and the kid has the flashlight and it makes the T-Rex's pupil get smaller. I was traumatized by Jurassic Park as a kid, right? Like I still get freaked out when it's raining outside and it's dark and I'm by trees. I think a T-Rex is going to swoop down and just fucking gobble me up. And I'm 41, right? Like when it's that dynamic of like the creatures are gigantic and there's no reasoning with them, that it's not like you can like explain something to them. They're just these fucking killing machines. That's really scary stuff. And I feel like this episode leans way more into just like kaiju and culture versus like the fear of a giant fucking thing eating you. You know?
It does. Especially when they get when they really move into like the later part of the episode, which is more about Japan and then other parts of Asia.
Yeah.
And they get into and another thing I loved in this episode was the idea that like the kaiju always the movies are never about the giant monsters.
Right.
You could tell the movies that are just about the giant monsters are usually the ones that aren't great. You take like a movie like The Host by Bong Joon-ho, which is about class, the difference in class distinction, and also about pollution. And you make this like phenomenal monster movie by a guy who would later go on to win Best Director at the Oscars.
Right.
They mention and Michael Gingold shows up to go into depth about Gamera and Gamera 3, which is a movie I never heard of that is now on my list.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, most ridiculous, scariest thing in this entire episode?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Big Man Japan.
Okay, I knew you were gonna fucking say that. Fucking say that. Yeah, I've never heard of that. I have no idea what that is. And weirdly enough, this episode had a lot of lists, and I think one of the lists was like best giant monster fighters. And so I have no idea what the fuck that movie is. It looks weird as shit.
Charlotte and I gave each other this exact look. We just went,
yeah. Right. And sometimes when they do these Shudder shows, I do kind of feel like they maybe are grasping a little bit, or they want to show something that they know people haven't seen. So it can kind of be like, oh, we're showing you something different that you're not expecting on this show. So I don't know if like this deserves to be on a ranking. There was another thing that I kind of had some issue with too. Like they said like best Godzilla movies, and they listed all the Godzilla movies. They did a lot of lists this episode. And one was like must-see giant monster movies, and one was best Godzilla movies. And there was like overlap with a lot of them too. Like Godzilla -1 was on all of them. You know, Mike Bongiorno and I have been kind of corresponding about these episodes because he's watching this show too, and he's giving me his 2 cents. And he was saying that like he completely disagrees with that Godzilla ranking. I kind of want to bring it back to what you said though about like these movies being about other subjects. Like when it's not just about the giant monster, then it's way better. And one thing that they do in this episode is they talk about Cloverfield. Now, Cloverfield was one of those things where you didn't know what it was. And it was really like capitalizing on that J.J. Abrams. He didn't direct it, but like he was a producer. That mystery box thing. And you're like looking for all these clues. And there was all this like viral marketing where you were trying to figure out what the fuck Cloverfield was.
That was Matt Reeves, right?
Was it Matt Reeves? You're probably right. I'll
I
look it
think
up in a second. But like,
easily his best movie.
wait, what? Are you
I'm
fucking
just
with me? Yeah, yeah,
well,
yeah.
I mean, unless we could cut the last 30 minutes of the Batman out.
Right. Well, but he also did some of those fucking amazing Planet of the Apes movies too.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about
Yeah, yeah. I was
that.
like, what?
I was just trying to like stoke the Batman flame.
Yeah, yeah. It's okay. You know, it's funny. This is a total side note, but like, last night my brother-in-law and my wife were like, "Hey, you looking forward to Joker?" Because they know I'm a comic book guy, and I was like, "No, I don't want to see the new fucking Joker at all." But
It's got a lot of mixed reviews. I've
uh,
read like some
yeah.
people said it's amazing, and then some people said that it feels like the director is making a bad movie on purpose, and I'm like, that makes me want to see it.
Well, I mean, okay, I don't want to derail our conversation,
Yeah, go.
but it's a good way to plug my other channel, Comic Books Transformed. If you ever want to see me talk about comics, guys. But you didn't like the first Joker, right?
I did not. I
Okay.
thought it was overrated.
Okay, good, good, good. We're on the same page. All right, back to Cloverfield. So Cloverfield, though, I think for us has more significance than people in another country or people in other parts of this country because it's all about people surviving in New York when this giant monster is attacking. And it's from that ground level perspective. And they make a point in this episode to talk about 9/11 and how Cloverfield is kind of like this metaphor for 9/11. And I was like, oh, they got that fucking right.
Yeah, I remember like Cloverfield was a big time event movie. I think like that and then Paranormal Activity
Yup.
probably are the movies that kind of helped found footage uh like reestablish itself after probably over a decade after. When did Cloverfield come out? It was because Blair Witch was 99. Cloverfield
Yeah.
has to be like almost like the later 2000 aughts,
Yeah,
right?
let me
Like
look it up because you
I'm
said
thinking,
Matt Reeves was director too. 2008 is when it came
yeah.
out.
So yeah, we're talking nearly a decade from Blair Witch, and that, and then I think Paranormal Activity really like brought back the found footage subgenre, and it was just such an interesting way to do a monster movie because like the thing about monsters is they have that scope. They're gigantic, so to look at that from the ground up instead of from the sky down, or or as Jordan Vogt Roberts would do in Kong Skull Island, give it the Apocalypse Now treatment, where
Yeah.
that probably, I am not even kidding when I say this, one of my favorite shots in any movie is the helicopters coming against the orange sky and then Kong standing up. Is just, that is fucking cinema right there.
Yes. But you know what?
But
You bring up a point that I want to talk about too, which is they talk about Gareth Edwards Godzilla as well, right?
I'm
And
sorry,
they
you brought up Gareth Edwards Godzilla.
oh, Danny,
Oh,
Danny.
sorry, what?
You're pretty spicy this morning, Danny, in your mom's apartment over there. I like how she's like walking by and giving commentary too. But yeah, I know, I understand why you would
At,
snore for
at
Gareth
least
Edwards.
at least the guy from Breaking Bad is gonna fight Godzilla at the. Oh, he's dead. Oh, okay.
Oh, within the first 10 minutes, no problem. Yeah, let's follow these characters we don't care about at all. No, I like they talk about seeing Godzilla from the ground level, and they show that scene with Elizabeth Olsen where she's going into the shelter and she turns around and Godzilla's right there. Um, like I think that, and this is like everyone fucking knows this. This is just duh. But like Gareth Edwards is like a master of scale in his movies. Like you can really feel how giant something is in his movies. And for the limited time that Godzilla's on screen in that version of Godzilla, it's really fucking impressive. But then it's just not an interesting movie at all. And I think that like moving forward with our technology, our way of making movies, there should be more movies where you really do get that sense of scope, that sense of like, oh my God, look how big this is, look how scary it is. And that's what like kaiju, and they talk about it in this episode too. The idea of like kaiju as like forces of nature, the idea of like kaiju as the atomic bomb. Like I think that that's the way we should go with kaiju in general. Is like you can't escape them. This is life. That's where it gets really fucking scary.
I think that's also one of my biggest problems with the newer Godzilla Kong movies
Yeah.
is that you're the thing that makes these monsters so special is their scope and size.
Right.
And you put them in like this Middle Earth or whatever it's called.
With Frodo.
Yeah, and they're fighting, they're fighting the orcs and all this thing. No, but like you put what is it called? The
Hollow Earth, right?
Hollow Earth, Middle Earth.
Yeah.
You put them in Middle Earth. Yeah, they're
Yeah.
fighting the trees. Godzilla versus Helm's Deep. That's the next movie.
That'd be kind of awesome. Okay.
It would. But the problem I have is that they are constantly surrounded by other things that are that size. And
right.
Godzilla doesn't feel special anymore. Kong doesn't feel special anymore. And I think it was Dave Schilling. I wrote this down. I think it was him and Ryan Turek who were talking about Edwards Godzilla and the newer Godzilla universe movies. And I think I think it was Dave Schilling who said, like, we haven't learned to feel anything yet. Right. And I think that's the biggest problem. And we've talked about this a lot when we covered Monarch, is that those new MonsterVerse movies, they really struggle at going back and forth between we're going to focus on the human drama and the human characters versus we're going to give you all that monster action you want, and they can't find that balance. So and the movies, they're always fun but missing something for me. And I think that's why I loved Godzilla -1 so much, is because the monster felt incredibly threatening in a way it hasn't felt in many, many years. And at the same time, I cared more about the human characters than I think I'd ever cared about a human character in a monster movie before. Right. And like even going back to Tremors, that movie has the perfect balance. And they start by talking about, like, the monsters in Tremors look great. They look amazing. And they're scary as hell. And you also love every character in that movie. Right. And you're hanging on every, you get Burt Gummer and Reba McEntire shooting the shit out of one of the graboids in the basement. You get, Kevin Bacon and Fred Ward playing off each other so well. It's a perfect movie.
Yeah. And see, it goes back to that thing that we've said like multiple times in the past few weeks, where it's like the characters, where you care about the specific characters. Duh, we all know this. But like one example that you and I use frequently is like Alien and Aliens. Now, I don't think that anyone would say that the xenomorph is a giant monster, but you can absolutely say the alien queen is a giant monster, right?
Oh, definitely.
And that's one of those things where it's like you have the Marines and you just care about them so much that you quote the dialogue. Like, and Godzilla -1, yet another perfect example. They even say in this fucking episode of Horror's Greatest, where it's like you could take Godzilla out of the movie and it's still a really great movie. And I think that one of us said that when we did our review, where it could just literally be like a war movie or something where it's like, they just talk about the atomic bomb.
It's an incredible story about post-atomic bomb Japan.
Yeah.
And oh, by the way, there's also fucking Godzilla, who's now trying to destroy the city.
Yeah.
You put a question up on the bottom before. What was the
favorite Godzilla movie that's not -1?
Yeah. What do you have one?
It's kind of hard because I like the cheesy, goofy Godzilla movies, where that's what I grew up on. I definitely don't like the fucking Roland Emmerich version, that's for sure. But I like where it's like them fighting Ghidra, King Ghidorah or whatever. So I think it's like the I don't even remember the fucking title, but it's like where like Mothra and Godzilla fight King Ghidorah. I think it's like go ahead.
That might be either like is that All Out Attack? I don't know. They mentioned that one.
Yeah,
There's a
it was in
bunch
one of
of
their.
Destroy All Monsters. There's a bunch of like combo movies.
Yeah.
More recently, they've done like Final Wars and where it's like every Godzilla monster. In fact, you brought up Roland Emmerich. They purposely bring back that Godzilla just to be killed, which is
Right.
fantastic.
Right.
My favorite growing up was Godzilla versus the Smog Monster,
Right.
Hedorah,
Yes.
which wasn't even as silly as some of the other ones, but it's still
No.
one of the sillier ones. But that's another movie where they make a point in this where that's a movie about the pollution of Japan, and the monster is a pollution monster. It eats garbage and
Yeah.
smog. I also loved, I mean, it's a more recent one, but yeah, Shin Godzilla was like insane. And if you've never seen the original, the 1954 movie is phenomenal. It really is very good.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have not seen the original, and then I've not seen Shin Godzilla. And believe me, Shin Godzilla came up so much when everyone was talking about Godzilla -1. I'm like, fuck, I need to see that. I got to see
Yeah.
where all this shit's streaming. But I just love Godzilla as a character. And did you have a Godzilla toy when you were a kid?
Fuck yeah.
Okay, man, that was so intense. Spit came out of your mouth for that one.
I know. I was like, shit. Yeah.
It's okay. It's okay. I'm not even wearing any
Godzilla.
pants, so we're good. But that's a weird combo
Donald
there.
Duck in it.
But yeah, and one last thing before we wrap this up too, I just want to talk about Pacific Rim, which they mentioned Pacific Rim in this, and I always feel like Pacific Rim doesn't get enough love. I actually really love. You know me, I'm a huge. Exactly. And I think that like every single thing that we just talked about, that was going on in his mind, going into his notebooks where he's doing all of his drawings. Like it has that kind of sense of scale, like Gareth Edwards' Godzilla movie has. Maybe just in a few moments, not as much as Gareth Edwards does in his version of Godzilla. But then it also has that really scary aspect to the kaiju. Like there's that one scene where the girl who eventually pilots the Jaeger, they show her as a child, and there's like a fucking kaiju coming after her in the streets. That's a really scary sequence.
Yeah,
Good.
I love. You know the Asylum, like the company that makes like
Oh
their super.
no.
I just remember when Pacific Rim came out, I saw Atlantic Rim.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like that and Transmorphers.
Oh yeah. Well, that's a crazy fucking.
So here's a good question, I think, for us to kind of end this episode up on.
Go ahead.
What I love that you keep putting like shocker. Pete has never seen this. Pete. So
the question is, what has Pete seen?
what would be like of the three? What would be like your top three movies that were shown in this episode that you've not seen that you would say, okay, these are the three I'm going to check out first?
Ooh, that is a really, really good question. The Host, because I've seen parts of The Host and I was like, oh, damn, that looks good. And, you know, I love Parasite. The Host, they show Monsters for a second. Gareth Edwards' movie Monsters.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always wanted to see that. Then, last but not least, for me, would be Shin Godzilla.
Okay,
those would be my three.
I've seen all of those, and I highly recommend all of them.
Yeah.
Gareth Edwards' Monsters is a very quiet monster movie, and you'll see what I mean when you see it. It's very good. I liked it. For me, just because of like the what the fuck factor, I have to put Big Man Japan on there, even though I feel like that's a movie that after about 15 minutes, I'm going to be like, okay, I've had enough.
Right.
A movie that was mentioned very, very quickly that I'm only putting on my list because of the director is The Great Yokai War, which it was done by Takashi Miike, who's done Audition and Gozu, and he's insane. And every time I've ever seen a Takashi Miike movie, I've been forever changed by it. Ichi the Killer is another one. So The Great Yokai War. And then I would definitely want to see Gamera 3. And now I'm cheating. I'm going to throw one more. I've never seen any Ultraman stuff.
Ditto.
And I I know that there's a Shin Ultraman that came out a couple of years ago that people were raving about, and I
Yeah.
really like to see that. But yeah, I'd also, of course, love to go back and watch a bunch of like those 50s movies, like Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, that like I've only seen in like clips.
Right.
Like I saw them probably when I was like 8 years old.
Right.
So yeah, I'd love to revisit some of that stuff.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny because we kind of got focused on Godzilla and the kaiju, which I think they do in this episode of Horror's Greatest. And you know what? There was one point I wanted to bring up too that I totally forgot to bring up. The guy who is the creature designer for Cloverfield is one of the talking heads in this episode. And he brings up a point that I think is really, really worth bringing up, where he was talking about how like Japanese design, like he said that he said that they were like extremely brave, and that he would seem kind of like conservative based on like if you compare his designs to their designs, right? Like they're not afraid to like just do crazy things with their designs. And now you mentioned Ultraman. I really do want to watch some Ultraman myself. And Ultraman kind of goes from this kind of horror stuff that we've been talking about, this giant monster horror, and it kind of starts to bring you into that Power Ranger territory. And I'm a big Power Ranger guy, and so I like that kind of overlap there too.
Ultraman. I grew up with Power Rangers, and then because of my sister, I also had all of those terrible Power Ranger spin-offs.
Oh yeah, of course.
Big Bad Beetleborgs.
Big Bad Beetleborgs. That's right.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
So bad.
Oh, there's a whole bunch of VR Troopers.
Troopers.
Right.
Yeah.
Super
Beetleborgs.
Yeah.
Had the Jay Leno.
Yep. Elvis thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Terrible.
No, I know, but it's just cool because I think that the creativity and the weirdness you really get in this genre, and you really get it from the kaiju genre, and you know, like, good.
It's funny because the more I'm thinking about it, you just brought up Power Rangers, and what I liked about Power Rangers is we grew up with Voltron,
right.
That was Voltron was basically a kaiju robot it was basically Pacific Rim.
Yep.
You formed a giant kaiju robot to fight the monster of the week, who was a guy in a rubber suit, and it wasn't. That was cartoon, but that was Power Rangers. See, I just confused them. But
it's all good.
That was basically like I remember Voltron as a kid, and it was one of my favorite things. I had the toys. I put them together. I'll form the head, and that was like one of that and Godzilla were really my introductions to the kaiju style movies.
Yeah, it's amazing stuff what comes out of Japan, whether it's animation or these rubber suit movies, just so much interesting design, beautiful things. I mean, and just think all it took was for us to drop atomic weapons onto millions of people in crowded cities. But anyway, that's a fucking horrible joke. But no, I mean, what I'm getting at with that is that Japanese culture, which so much of this originates from, they took the horror of what was done to them and turned it into something so imaginative and cool that we're still talking about it today, decades and decades later. So that's a good way to wrap up this episode. Danny, you want to tell these cats, these giant city-side cats, what we're covering on the last cast?
Well, we're covering Horror's Greatest. You can watch our review of episode 1, which was all about horror tropes and cliches. We have a review of Strange Darling up on the channel. I have a short up, non-spoiler, and then you and I spoiled the hell out of it and talked about it for about 35 minutes. So if you've seen Strange Darling and you want to see an in-depth review of that, we have that up. And then there's Charlotte and I went to Spirit Halloween. There's a kind of like an unbagging video that we did of the stuff that we got at Spirit Halloween for our first time of the year.
That's fucking awesome.
I did a book review of The Future Was Now by Chris Mashawati, a phenomenal book about 1982 sci-fi and horror movies coming out. And yeah, and then we're going to be jumping into a review of another new genre horror adjacent movie called Red Rooms very soon, so you can look for that up on the channel as well.
Shit, yeah. Good promoting there, my friend. Guys, thank you so much for watching our discussion of Horror's Greatest. We want to hear what you think about this show in general. We like just kind of adding to what the talking heads have said. So why don't you guys add to what we've said too in the comments? But until then, Danny and I will see you guys